The 90s were a special time to be a fan of video games. I truly cherish those memories. Whether I was pumping quarters into a Mortal Kombat arcade cabinet or sucking down an old Ecto Cooler, the days were golden. Much like fighting games, beat-em-ups were a huge staple of 90s gaming, with classics such as Streets of Rage, Turtles in Time, and of course Final Fight, captivating audiences across arcades and living rooms alike. Okay, so Final Fight technically came out in 1989, believe it or not, but you get the point. Amongst the sea of brawler hopefuls was a bit of an odd duck called Night Slashers. Released in 1993 by Data East, the game allowed for up to 3 players at a time and stood out from the crowd with its unique horror theme and rather large movesets for characters, at least by brawler standards. The Japanese version of the arcade original was a rather bloody affair, though the violence could be turned down a bit in other territories. Violence in video games, if you didn't know, was a contentious topic throughout the 90s, even leading to congressional hearings right around the time that Night Slashers was released. I'm sure for many of you this conjures up memories of the original Mortal Kombat, Night Trap, and of course, Lethal Enforcers. Long story short, I'm confident that the controversy surrounding violent video games at the time played somewhat of a role in the attempt to censor Night Slashers. You gotta love the old green blood is better than red blood mentality. While Night Slashers did apparently see a re-release on Nintendo Switch in 2018, I can't seem to find it on the eShop anymore, so you'll have to let me know in the comments below if I either missed out or am missing it somehow. It's a shame if it's gone because I would have loved having it in my collection. Alright, all that history out of the way, the reason I bring any of this up is because Night Slashers has returned, but not in its original arcade form. Rather, a new remake coming to us from Storm Trident SA and Forever Entertainment. But does Night Slashers Remake do the original justice, or should this arcade classic have stayed in its grave? Let's find out in our full review. Real quick, don't let independent content get buried. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and head over to patreon.com/idreamofindiegames where you can gain Discord access to the greatest indie gaming community, early shows, and so much more. Your new community is waiting to meet you. Night Slashers Remake attempts to revitalize the 1993 arcade original with a new art style, remix soundtrack, and the addition of a 4th character entirely new to this version of the game. Much like other arcade brawlers, you'll bash through monstrous foes across 7 distinct levels. Enemies attack from both sides of the screen, and once you've cleared the screen of all attackers, you can advance forward, eventually reaching an end boss for that area. It plays out much like any other arcade brawler, though as I alluded to in my intro, Night Slashers was well respected for its somewhat deeper combat system, and this version of the game tries to stay true to that vision. In Night Slashers Remake, much like the original, the world has been overtaken by monsters and humanity is on the brink of extinction. It would seem these werewolves, zombies, and other abominations are being created in a hospital, and now it's up to our 4 heroes to save the day by bashing them into a bloody pulp. The story is about as original as a cover of Michael Jackson's Billie Jean, but let's face it, nobody's playing an arcade brawler for the story. Narrative cliches aside, while the introduction of the game does remain true to the arcade classic, things quickly change as the still gorgeous, in my opinion anyways, original pixel art begins to melt into a new high-definition art style that will leave fans of the 1993 game feeling mixed. Regardless of how I felt about the new artistic direction in this version of Night Slashers, I have to credit the developers for staying true to how the sequence of events play out. From the very first level through the final boss encounter, each world, enemy, and musical composition has been left mostly unaltered outside of the obvious visual upgrade, we'll call it, sure. Yes, a new remixed version of the soundtrack is available, however, players also have the option of selecting the original soundtrack, which I personally ended up preferring. The remix songs aren't particularly bad by any means, but you're talking to a guy that still buys Fruit Roll-Ups and Captain Crunch cereal because they remind him of the 90s. Personally, I tend to like things that were great to remain the way that they were, and even today, the OG Night Slashers hosts a wonderful sounding set of compositions that didn't necessarily require remixing at all. The gritty, muffled arcade tracks deliver relentless drumming, moody synths, and catchy melodies that serve as the perfect backdrop for punching zombies into ooey-gooey pools of Kool-Aid. When switching to the new soundtrack, some of the melodies are preserved, but the higher quality oddly kinda takes away from some of the charm that remains all these years later in the original music. Options are always a good thing, however, and it's nice that players will be able to choose whether they want to have the original score playing or the newly remixed one. The sound effects in this game are pretty impressive. Hammering away at your enemies will often lead to disgustingly brutal squishy sounds that do a wondrous job of making the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Ugh, they're really gross. Characters have voices too, and will shout out 2 to 3 word phrases when executing special attacks. Small touches like this in the sound design do a nice job of paying tribute to past arcade brawlers. But when it comes to that visual facelift of Night Slasher's Remake, it really pales in comparison to the classic pixel art. While the hand-drawn style featured in this version of the game isn't particularly awful, much like the remix soundtrack, it simply isn't as good as what already existed. Animations feel a bit lacking in spots, the backgrounds aren't nearly as detailed as the classic game, and the new cutscenes between levels, which are really just still images and text, feel pretty lifeless and boring. It's a clean and safe artistic direction, but I wasn't the biggest fan myself. Now, if you were hoping for the retro filters included in the game to help bring back some of the 90s charm, you'll also be disappointed. While there are a few filters to choose between, they all fail to impress, and if anything give off the false illusion of playing a Sega Saturn game as opposed to a 1993 pixel art brawler. At least much of the gore remains present, with enemies spewing blood all over the screen, and yes, it is red blood. When it comes to gameplay, Night Slasher's Remake does a decent job of showing players the ropes. As I've mentioned, this is a game that tries to go a bit beyond your average turn-your-brain-off brawler with a bevy of special attacks and combos alongside team-up attacks. Because of this, it's recommended to watch the built-in tutorial that shows you all of the different gameplay elements. While it's a little weird that you won't actually control the tutorial yourself, it serves the purpose. Players will have a basic combo activated by simply mashing away at the attack button. However, more advanced moves include running attacks, a screen-filling super attack that steals away some of your health and deals out massive damage to all enemies on screen, and even airborne attacks and specials are here. While the amount of combos, team-up attacks, and grabs is impressive, many of the moves feel unnecessary, and it's likely a vast majority of players won't be using much beyond standard combo attacks and grabs. While the special attacks are effective enough, using them on any difficulty beyond the easy setting results in losing far too much of your life bar to make them feel worthwhile. And on the topic of difficulty, Night Slasher's Remake features very easy, medium, hard, and nightmare options. Unlocking a stage for a specific difficulty so that you can play it later without going through the entire game requires completing it once at that chosen difficulty. When it comes to the actual brawling action itself, Night Slasher's Remake feels merely serviceable. The hit detection isn't perfect, though each character does feel unique from one another. The swift Christopher Smith, for example, relies on kicking his foes. The 2 female characters, including Liao, who is new to this version of the game, are a bit speedier. Rounding out the cast is your standard brute character Jake Hunter. It's a decent selection, and the fact that the game can be played with 4 players locally on screen at once is a really nice touch. While battling your way through enemies, there will be plenty of barrels to bust open for items that contribute to your score, as well as restorative items. Your score does matter beyond bragging rights, as extra lives can be earned throughout each level. There are also a decent assortment of weapons that can be picked up and tossed at your foes. Levels vary in length, but the entire game can be completed in about 20 minutes or so depending on your skill level and chosen difficulty. Should you fail to complete a level, it's back to the very start of that level again, and for some reason, player 2 in my game came back with fewer lives than before. I'm not sure if this was a bug in the game or a design choice, but it was odd either way. Equally odd are the controls themselves. By default, if using an Xbox controller, your standard attack will be on the A button, the B button will be for jumping, and X will unleash a special. I prefer X as my attack and A as my jump, but unfortunately, no matter how many times I tried to reconfigure the control scheme, it would revert back to the default settings. This was frustrating, and I'm sure there's a workaround, but it shouldn't be this difficult to get the buttons mapped for player preference. Overall, the action is just merely serviceable here, but it gets old pretty quick. Levels are short and occasionally broken up by a few mediocre bonus rounds, and boss encounters aren't all that exciting either. Many of the bosses would even get stuck in place at times, allowing me to haplessly punch away at them. The game functions as a brawler, but becomes hard to recommend when better brawlers exist today, such as the excellent Shredder's Revenge. The difficulties also didn't feel much different between normal and hard, though credit the game for having a few unlockables such as new colors for characters. Outside of the standard arcade mode, there is a custom mode that allows for the use of unlockable mutators. These range from making corpses explode during gameplay to having more lives, and even disabling special attacks. While this is a neat idea, none of the available options made the game more fun. Players can also enjoy the soundtrack of the game, both original and remixed, through a music player on the main menu. You know, while sometimes remakes of classic games breathe new life into them, I didn't feel this was the case with Night Slasher's Remake. It is a competent brawler in its own right, yet its very existence feels somewhat strange when the original game looks and plays better than this. And yet, apparently, the original game isn't that easy to play legally these days. So in some ways, this remake made me a little bit sad about how games can be lost to time and highlights the importance of preservation. As a standalone product releasing in 2024, Night Slasher's Remake just feels really mediocre in every sense of the word. I don't think Brawler fans are going to get much out of it, and I don't think fans of the original game are going to like many of the changes. This means that it's a product that just sort of exists. Here at I Dream of Indie Games, we believe games are so much more than a number, which is why we utilize our 3-tier Genie Lamp system for rating titles. A Bronze Lamp represents a good game with quite a few issues. A Silver Lamp is a great game with just a few nagging problems, and the elusive Golden Genie Lamp of Approval is for those essential indie releases. We also have the Rusty Lamp for mediocre titles that have just a faint glimmer of hope, and the dreaded Indie Krampus for games you should avoid. With that said, I'm awarding Night Slasher's Remake the Rusty Lamp.